As 2022 sneaks up on us, how are things looking for the Alberta economy? Joining me now to talk about this is Charles St-Arnaud. He's the chief economist for Alberta Central, which is the central banking facility, service bureau, and trade association for Alberta's credit unions. Charles, welcome to Bridge City News.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Alberta's gone through some pretty tough economic times over the last few years. Now, especially we're in the middle of the pandemic right now. When will we finally see the light at the end of the tunnel here in our province?
Well, we're already kind of seeing it. Like 2021 was kind of the rebound from the hard hit from COVID and the secondary shock from the drop in oil prices. So we had a very sharp economic contraction in 2020. And then now economic activity has been picking up. And we expect that by early 2022, the Alberta economy will pass its peak that it reached in 2014. So we'll finally start to expand from where we were 7 years ago.
Now, as usual, the energy sector is leading the way here in the province, but do you think that will continue throughout 2022? Will we see oil at $70, $80 US a barrel consistently?
The oil industry has been very important in 2021, but the economic recovery has been relatively broad-based. It's been consumer, it's been oil, it's been a bit of investment. But obviously, oil has been, I would say, probably one of the least told story or the least understood story. The turnaround in that industry has been extremely important and major. If we go back in the middle of the pandemic in April 2020, the value of the oil produced in the province was about $1 billion per month. Turn around to October 2021, it's now 10 billion. That's about 3 billion more than the peak we had in 2014. So the value of what we're producing now is higher than it was in the previous boom. And that's major because that will have some very positive tailwind on our economy, pushing wages, pushing income for the workers industry. It will also lead to better investment in the industry. But I will temper that we're probably not coming back to the boom years of the pre-2050, but it's still a positive tailwind on our economy going forward.
Now, Charles, some industry analysts say that our province is actually now one of the leaders in Canada for renewable energy projects. Can you explain why this is happening and where maybe some of these projects are being built?
Well, I think gradually people are realizing that Alberta has a tremendous potential in renewable energy. We know that there's a big transition worldwide to reduce our carbon emission, to decarbonize our whole economy. And obviously, here in Alberta, we can either see it as a challenge to our more traditional industry, which is oil and gas, or see the opportunity. And this opportunity are really in the renewable. We have the resources. We have, well, being in southern Alberta, we see how many days of sunshine we have, and we can really harvest that. We have tremendous wind power. Also, what sometimes I find is lesser exploited, but has a lot of potential. Geothermal could be big in the province, especially considering our expertise with all the drillers in the oil and gas industry that have tremendous expertise into drilling holes in the ground. So we have those capacity. It's just what we need is the investment, but also seizing those opportunities as they arise. The way I think we can see renewable right now in Alberta is probably where oil sands were in the 80s. Yeah, we're planting the seed for an industry that will be there in 20, 30 years from now, and that will be generating tremendous amount of revenues and wealth.
Now, you mentioned wind energy earlier, and here, when people talk about winds that are 100 to 120 kilometers an hour, we just call that a Wednesday here in Lethbridge, category 1 winds. But we see a lot of the wind farms and the wind turbines absolutely creating that. Any idea how many jobs these green energy projects will create and how much of an economic boost they'll actually provide for our economy?
Well, some research reports are saying that the whole transition to carbon neutrality by 2050 could generate about 150,000 jobs in Alberta alone and generate about for $60 billion to our economy by 2050. So we're talking big money, and it's all that investment phase of creating those projects and then gradually building that capacity.
Now, we've had some new hydrogen project announcements recently as well, including the massive expansion and emissions-cutting retrofit of Dow Chemical's ethylene plant. Charles, how soon will we see tangible economic growth kicking in from the hydrogen projects?
Well, hydrogen, we're still roughly at the infancy of that source of energy. It's has a tremendous potential because a lot of industry cannot rely on electrification. Like a good example would be just freight train. It's too energy consuming to just use our electricity. But by using hydrogen, you could probably potentially avoid using diesel fuel. So that's where the potential, a lot of those big industrial plant could also be running on hydrogen. And us, Alberta, having tremendous resource in natural gas, we can use that resource to create hydrogen. So we're still at the infancy, but it's one of those where we're planting the seed for where we want to be in the future.
So where is Alberta at when it comes to the tech sector? Are we seeing more tech companies potentially moving to Calgary, where you are, and filling up some of those vacant downtown buildings?
We're seeing a lot more investment. Like 2021 was one of the best year, I think, in terms of investment in the tech industry. Alberta has been attracting way more than its fair share of compared to other provinces in terms of foreign investment in tech. So there's a lot of hope and a lot of positive uh, environment being built right now in Calgary to bring that more of a tech hub that will revitalize in some ways our city.
Now, residential real estate seems to have had a fairly good year in our province. Why do you think that was, and will that continue into the new year?
Yeah, well, there's different reason why real estate did well. First is, well, with the pandemic, many were starting to think about, well, maybe I need more space. You're starting to work from home. Well, having a proper home office starts to make sense. Having outdoor space when you cannot go, when you're stuck at home, makes a lot of sense. So there was that natural demand where preference was changing. But also, even though the economic contraction was big, there was still a significant proportion of the population that actually enjoyed no change in their revenues. Yeah, they couldn't go and spend, and they had more money. So there was more income available to go and house purchases, and also low interest rates helping too. We've had record low mortgage rate, and that has been helping the real estate market. But we're seeing the latest numbers. We're still having a level of transaction volumes much higher than where we were in the previous peak in 2014, and that is, I think, to continue going into 2022. We have a lot of positives. So the labor market continues to improve. The continued improvement in the oil and gas, that increased value of production and that leads to increased income, will continue to push the housing market. And I'll be surprised, we might have a little rush of buyer coming in the market, especially in the first half of the year, to try to lock in a mortgage before rate starts to go up around the mid of 2022. But even with the rate hike, I still think that housing activity will remain close to what we have right now. So will remain very strong.
You know, I've been telling my adult kids who are back in Southern Ontario, to get out of Southern Ontario, come here to Alberta, where, housing is a lot more affordable, because there's no way that they can afford a down payment, on a $750,000, $800,000 house. Even 5 points down, you're $40,000. That's very difficult to try and raise that kind of money on an $800,000 home. So I'm kind of working on my kids, my adult children, to move back home here to Alberta. Now, Charles, will the commercial real estate sector, as we talked about earlier with those big towers, office towers in Calgary being vacant, will they see any improvements there, or do you think the struggle will continue into 2022?
Well, wait, it will continue in 2022. It will take time to see the turnaround. We'll need to see new businesses being created. So we're still in the early stage of we're in the recovery. We're starting the expansion, and that will be when new businesses will start to increase. We'll be able, especially here in Calgary, attract more of those tech industries that will take some more space in those towers. But it's a slow process. But there's a lot of project to help, in some ways, rebalance the supply and demand of commercial real estate, especially converting some of the buildings to other use than just pure commercial. But it's a long-term project. It's not something that will turn around within a year or two.
Now, Lethbridge and other areas here in southwestern Alberta has a thriving food processing industry. Where do you see that headed to in 2022?
That's for sure. It will continue. Like, everybody needs to eat. That's and there's a lot of know-how. One of the things that's often misunderstood or not really well appreciated is how much we talk about tech industry in Calgary, where when we talk about, oh, Amazon cloud computing and all those kind of things. But that sounds maybe sexy, but a lot of the agri-tech industry is very important, very big in Alberta, and there's a lot of investment happening in that, and a lot of it is centered around the Lethbridge area, and that will continue because, well, nothing will change. We'll still need to eat in 2022 and 2023, and finding those new technology to reduce the cost and improve yields will be important.
How about the agriculture sector here in southwestern Alberta and maybe across the province? Will things continue to improve for a lot of our producers?
Well, I think many producers will want to forget 2021 with the drought and in some ways the devastating harvest for many. So the hope is we'll get a better harvest in 2022, especially that with very weak supply around the world for wheat and other agricultural product, prices are still very high. So if they just get normal yields in 2022, they'll be able to have very strong revenue. So that's the hope going in 2022, is that we actually have a normal harvest season so they can at least recover some of the loss of 2021.
Now, Charles, when it comes to the retail sector, are we anticipating any improvements? And are you seeing more people shopping online as opposed to going to your brick and mortar stores?
I think early in the pandemic, obviously, everybody's shift to online, and that was probably a bit of an issue for many brick and mortars. We still have that trend, but I think a lot of retailers have been very quick at offering curbside pickup, being able to pre-order online, but to pick up at the store, so you don't have to pay the shipping fees. So there's still that attraction. And when we look at retail sales in general in the province, we're actually doing relatively well. We're slightly ahead of the rest of the country in terms of what I would call core retail sales. So if we remove motor vehicle sales and those kind of more volatile component, we're actually doing relatively well. So it's more of a question is, as we go back to normal, are consumers more willing to go back to the stores? I can see in Calgary, when you go to more independent store, there is a bit more, people are more willing to say, well, let's go to the small independent store this year for some of our Christmas gift, rather than ordering everything from online and delivered at home. So the hope is that a lot of consumers will make that switch gradually and realizing that they need to support their local.
Let's talk about a restaurant industry for just a moment here as well, Charles. They've been hit very hard by the COVID-19 pandemic. Is there light at the end of the tunnel there?
Well, it's an industry that is still struggling. We can still see it in the data. It's still an industry where level of employment is still well below where it was pre-COVID-19. Same in terms of level of economic activity in those sectors. So it's still struggling, and it's still hard for them because now we have, yes, it's easier for them. There's less restriction. It's only, you have the proof of vaccination, which helps the consumer to feel more safe at going into public spaces. But there's still, you can see it, capacity is still relatively weak. A lot of families have changed their behaviors. They kind of realize that, well, maybe having dinner at home, we've got used to it, so they're continuing a bit more. So the hope is gradually things will come to normal, but the pandemic is still not done. So we'll have to see. It will take longer for that industry to recover.
Which sectors in our economy here are you seeing the highest labor shortages? And will we see any changes in that regard?
Well, there's two big sectors where we're seeing labor shortages. One is, on one side, you have all the tech industry, which have been in high demand as every business is turning online for either working from home or setting up a selling platform online. So that area of specialized work has been extremely in demand. And very competitive. At the other end of the scale, it's the food and accommodation area, and some of the more frontline service workers are in high demand, and there's a lot of report of the business having issues finding workers in those sector, and there it's a combination of different factors. One is a lot of the workers who lost their job during the pandemic in those sectors are no longer working or looking for work in those industries. So a waiter who's lost his job in the food industry after so many waves of restrictions has decided, well, I'm moving on, I'm going to a new sector. So that kind of creates less worker available. Another factor that's very important in Canada is that the fact that we haven't had a lot of immigration over the past 2 years has dramatically reduced the size of our workforce. So in Alberta, my quick estimates is that we're probably missing about 50 to 55,000 workers compared to where we would be pre-pandemic. So that creates some frictions here and there in the labor market, and that sometimes it's surprising considering that our unemployment rate is still slightly above where it was pre-pandemic. But it's really a mismatch in terms of who's looking for work and who actually needs to hire people.
Charles St-Arnaud is the chief economist for Alberta Central. Thanks so much for joining me today from Calgary.
Thank you for having me.